BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7.
The last 12 months should have been the busiest in the history of America's space program. 14 shuttle missions should have carried 18 satellites into orbit, launched the long-awaited Space Telescope, and dispatched unmanned probes towards Venus, Jupiter, and the Sun. But none of this happened because 1 year ago, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. But in America and elsewhere, the determination to launch men into space remains undiminished. In a special programme this evening, we're going to be looking at the future of manned spaceflight.
Space shuttles won't be flying again for at least another year. And that means that space programmes in other countries have gained an unexpected boost. The Chinese and the Soviets are now offering to launch American satellites. The Europeans are designing a new generation of manned spacecraft, and the Japanese are planning to go to the moon. Meanwhile, the Soviets are quietly on target with their plans to put a cosmonaut on Mars within 15 years. And in America, that's given rise to calls for NASA to be given the cash to throw themselves into a new space race, the race to Mars.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning.
It was fear of the Soviets gaining control of space that first prompted President Kennedy to launch NASA at the moon. And so started the first space race. Landing a man on Mars means first building a station in space, and that's already an American goal.
Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade.
The popular image of the space station is an enormous rotating wheel. But this is what NASA plans to build within 9 years. A vast tubular structure the size of a tower block with a number of modules, some built by Europe and Japan. Here, scientists will live and work, arriving from Earth by the space shuttle. But while America plans, the Soviets have had space stations in orbit for over 15 years.
In February last year, the Soviets launched the first of a new generation of space stations. It's called Mir, the Russian for peace. Now, Mir is nothing like as large or as complex as the proposed International Space Station. After all, it's only 13 metres long. But it's been designed to expand. There are 6 of these docking ports for cargo craft carrying fuel and equipment, and the Soyuz craft, which ferries the cosmonauts to and from the Mir. And there are also large laboratory craft. And one of these laboratories will be launched in just a few months' time, and it will be carrying an X-ray telescope built by the University of Birmingham. But the space station is also the Soviets' launch pad to Mars. The enormous spacecraft needed for the journey would have to be assembled in space at the space station. The Soviets have already been practicing this sort of construction for years. 2 of their cosmonauts have also clocked up the longest stay in space, 237 days, almost the length of time it would take to get to Mars. Any day now, a new crew will be launched to Mir to start a record-breaking stay of over 300 days, and further stays of over a year are planned. So far, all this has been achieved using reliable, if somewhat old, technology. But in April, the Soviets are expected to test a new heavy launch vehicle, capable of launching the Soviet equivalent of the shuttle. Now, this new shuttle is designed to service their space station, which will now be kept permanently manned. If the test flights are successful, 1988 could see the Soviets' first manned shuttle flight, just when the American shuttle is planned to come back into service.
But the Soviet shuttle could be flying first, because the Americans have an awful lot to do to theirs before it can ever fly again. The Presidential Commission, which investigated the Challenger disaster, presented NASA with a long list of improvements they wanted made. And these centred around the shuttle's rocket boosters, because it was the failure of one of these that NASA and the Commission believe caused the accident. Now, these boosters are made in sections, and they're sealed to prevent the super-hot gases inside from leaking through the joints. NASA think the weather on the day of the launch was so cold that the synthetic rubber seals, they're called O-rings, and they're inside the rim just here, lost their flexibility and weren't able to seal the gap. So they've been redesigned with 3 rings instead of 2, and all of them will be made resistant to cold weather. The Commission has also told NASA to build an emergency escape system through an existing hatch just over here. But with that still to be designed, and the new boosters not due to be tested until March, the present plan to launch in February 1988 does seem extremely optimistic. And when this does fly again, the shuttle's top priority will be to launch NASA probes and military, possibly Star Wars material.
It'll be 1993 before the shuttle starts to carry material into space to build the American space station, and they're planning 8 launches a year. The first task will be to carry up the 5-metre struts that fit together in space to build a 100-metre tall framework called the keel. There have already been experiments trying to do this on a shuttle mission back in 1985 using a scaled-down version of the keel. Well, now the scientists are hard at work in the weightless environment of a large swimming pool, trying out the simplest ways of assembling the struts. And what they've come up with is a common node into which the pieces will fit with just a simple twist. And when the keel is assembled, it'll carry 3 laboratory modules, 1 American, 1 European, 1 Japanese. And to house the international scientists, there's also a habitation module, which Peter's been to see in Alabama.
The habitation module, like the labs, will be 40 feet long to fit into the shuttle's payload bay.
Well, this is just one version of the way that those living quarters could look, and once it's been transported up to the space station, it'll become home for 8 astronauts for 3 or even 6 months. So a certain amount of comfort has to be designed into it. Over here is the kitchen and eating area. That's the exercise area. This is the bathroom, the workstation, and from here onwards, it becomes the 8 astronauts' bedrooms.
Real astronauts have been brought in to test the design, particularly the workstation, where they'll monitor the outside and control robotic vehicles. Any design will also take into account the effects of weightlessness. Sleeping bags are stuck to the wall to stop the astronauts floating away as they sleep. And in the morning, there'll be live television or music.
The old ones are always the best.
Take your protein pills and put...
Well, before his protein breakfast, any self-respecting astronaut would no doubt head for here, the completely sealed Shah unit.
So how will the astronauts get the water off? Because apparently in the weightlessness of space, it sticks to your body rather like jelly. Well, that's where this special shower head comes in, because at the flick of a switch, it now becomes a rather efficient vacuum cleaner, sucking off the dirty blobs of water and the bacteria with them. Excuse me, I've got a bit of hoovering to do.
So after a quick vacuum, it's off to the kitchen for a bite to eat. Since there's no up or down in space, the storage units can be in the ceiling. But weightlessness has the same effect on the taste buds as a heavy cold, so sharp, thick sauces will be used, not just to brighten up the food, but also to stop potential free floaters like peas or sweet corn from escaping off the fork.
Well, that's definitely something to go to work on. One of the routine tasks will be the repair and maintenance of the space station itself, and from this work area you can monitor what's going on outside. Now, most of the damage could come from meteoroid storms, and if they manage to penetrate the outer skin, they could produce holes like this.
Which means sending an astronaut outside the station to repair the damaged area with a new sheet of aluminium.
Well, it's been quite a busy day here in the habitation module. I wonder what's been going on in the lab.
Well, the answer, Peter, is quite a lot, because the space station will be the base for experiments in everything, from biology to astronomy. And the astronaut scientists could be pioneering the space factories of the future, making products for us down here on Earth. In fact, the first product manufactured in space is already on sale. And this is it, a suspension of minute but perfectly regular latex spheres. And this is used to calibrate microscopes. In fact, they say it's worth about £250. So, will we see this label in the next century saying "Made in Space"? Well, it'll only be worth it if the products are small, light and very valuable. Drugs, perhaps, or advanced computer chips. Both have to be very pure, and purity can be improved enormously by escaping the problems of gravity.
Problems like convection. A hot fluid rises because it's lighter than the fluid around it. But without gravity, there's no weight anyway, so it doesn't rise. So no convection currents. And that's a big help with a technique called electrophoresis. It's used to purify drugs. And this model shows how. The mixture of chemicals which contains the drug you're after, represented by this light beam, is injected into the bottom of a tank of liquid. And as they're pumped slowly towards the top, a strong electric field applied across the tank pulls the chemicals sideways. Different chemicals are pulled different distances, and so they're separated into individual streams, one of which contains the drug. On Earth, convection currents caused by the heating effects of the electric field mix up the streams and ruin everything. But it's already been proved that in space, electrophoresis can produce drugs of very high purity.
When it comes to chips, too, in space it's easier to purify the semiconductor crystals from which they're made. We've got a model here of a slice through one of those crystals, and the impurities are represented by all of these green lights. The way of forcing those impurities out is by melting and reforming the crystal bit by bit, and that's done using a heating element, this one just here, all around the crystal. But on Earth, as the heating element moves through the crystal, the heat produces convection currents. Now they just mix up the impurities all over again. But in space, there are no convection currents, so the impurities are squeezed out, leaving a very pure crystal.
With this and other space research becoming vitally important and the industrialisation of space looming, Japan and Europe have no intention of being left out. With their own modules, both are sharing in the enormous cost of the American station. But the Europeans are worried that the Americans will control not only the flights out on the shuttle, but also the work that the scientists do once they're up there. And they're also concerned that the Americans may want to use the station for Star Wars research, so the Europeans may pull out altogether. So Europe is keen to become more independent and is busy developing a new generation of spacecraft on its own. This German concept, for instance, the Zenger, uses a plane to carry the rocket-powered spacecraft up the first 35 kilometres. Both can land at conventional airports and be quickly reused. And this is the familiar British HOTOL, carrying the idea a stage further. It uses just one entirely reusable vehicle. It's rocket-powered, but before it gets into space, it extracts the oxygen it needs from the atmosphere, much like a jet, and that makes it far cheaper to operate. But if these are still dreams, then large sums of money are being devoted to a new European mini-shuttle, Hermes. Launched at the tip of an Ariane rocket, this will be large enough to carry 4 astronauts up to the space station. It could also visit European free-flying modules. These would orbit close to the station, carrying delicate or dangerous materials. So Europe could finally become a major force in space.
Both the Europeans and the Americans are also hoping that the space station will be used to maintain their other space hardware.
Deep in space, if your satellite needs a 10 million mile service, then this is the recovery vehicle for the job. It's called the Orbital Maneuvering Vehicle, or OMV. And when it comes into service in 1991, it's going to have a very busy work schedule. Groups of thrusters here and round the side will help to maneuver the vehicle precisely onto its target. And then grappling arms here will grab hold of the satellites, telescopes, or any other spacecraft, ready for the OMV to then tow them back to the repair bay of the space station.
To practice the OMV's docking techniques, this full-sized model has been attached to an experimental rig.
The effect of weightlessness is produced by a minute cushion of compressed air, 5/1000th of an inch thick, being forced out underneath these footpads here, so the OMV can glide effortlessly across the smooth floor. Now, the rig is propelled by 6 jets at each corner, so that it and the model OMV can be maneuvered with immense precision. The whole thing weighs 1.5 tons, but just watch this.
The OMV is remotely controlled, as it would be from the space station, and steered towards the target. In this case, a model of the Space Telescope.
But the space station isn't just a lab or garage in space. It's hoped that it too will be a stepping stone into deeper space. The obvious first step would be to set up a manned base on the moon. But with the Soviets heading straight for Mars, the Americans might just bypass the moon and join in that race to the red planet.
In many ways, Mars is the planet most like Earth in our solar system. And this gave rise to our favourite fantasy, Martians. Early science fiction writers conjured up an enormous variety of Martian life, from little green men to weird and wonderful plants. Sadly, the reality is not so glamorous. Information sent back from unmanned probes showed no little green Martians, probably not even microscopic life in the soil. But if the planet can't support Martian life, it does have the resources to allow human life to survive. But at the moment, NASA is only committing money to an unmanned trip to Mars.
This could be one of the first vehicles to roll across the surface of Mars. It's a NASA-sponsored project at the University of Arizona, and it's called the Mars Ball.
At the moment, it can cope with fairly small slopes, and it can also climb over boulders about 2 feet high. It's not exactly nippy. It does 4 feet a minute, which means it'll take a whole day to do a kilometre. The wheels are made up of airbags shaped like the segments of a pie, and each segment can be inflated and deflated separately by using these valves, which will eventually run on the air in the Martian atmosphere. Now, those valves can be computer controlled from Earth, and the Mars rover would walk across the surface of the planet by partially deflating each segment in turn.
Because the Martian surface is likely to be rocky, NASA is interested in anything that could ride effortlessly over obstacles up to 2 feet high without having to go round them. Once on Mars, equipment strapped to the axle will photograph the surface and collect soil samples.
Meanwhile, the Soviets have nearly all the technology they need to take cosmonauts to Mars. The heavy launch vehicle designed to lift the shuttle can also be used to carry other payloads, and by adding a total of 8 strap-on boosters, the payload can be increased to an enormous 280 tons. And that's certainly enough to lift all the components of the Mars ship up to the Mir space station, where it would be assembled. In fact, it's likely that there would be 2 Mars spacecraft. One, basically a Mir habitat module attached to a massive rocket booster to carry the 3 crew. The other, also propelled by one of the boosters, would carry the Mars landing craft. and that would probably be a modified Soyuz.
Barring setbacks, it looks as though the Soviets could be on their way to Mars by the mid-1990s, before the Americans have even started their Mars mission, unless America decides to make Mars a national goal. Back in 1957, these headlines, with the Soviet Union apparently winning the race to the moon, galvanized America to launch its Apollo program. In 1995, headlines like these could have a similar effect. But whatever their nationality, astronauts setting off for Mars would face a long and potentially dangerous mission.
For instance, the round trip to Mars will take 2.5 years. So what about the side effects of weightlessness? Weightlessness affects the body in a number of ways. First, it upsets the inner ear, which causes space sickness, something that most astronauts suffer at one time or another. Over the years, they've found out how to minimize the effects of space sickness. Wedging yourself into a corner seems to help. And when it comes to sleeping arrangements, it's best if everyone agrees on which way is up. Apparently, opening your eyes to see your colleagues hanging upside down like bats is guaranteed to turn the strongest of stomachs.
More serious is the effect of weightlessness on the circulation and the muscles. Because it isn't being pulled down by gravity, all the blood, normally in the legs, rises to the head and the chest. This increases the volume of blood in this area, and the kidneys react by excreting fluid to reduce that volume, which means the astronaut ends up with 20% less blood. The problem comes when the astronaut lands on Mars or gets back to Earth. He may feel so faint he'll be unable to stand up. His muscles will also have wasted away through underuse. And the best antidote to all this seems to be a good workout.
Waist stretch, your right arm over your head and stretch to the left. Stretch. 2, 3, 4, stretch right. 6, 7, 8, stretch left. 2, 3, 4, and right. 6, 7, single time it. Left, right, left.
In future, they could even try a bit of weightlifting, replacing gravity with electromagnets. Now, you could make all of this heavier by turning up the power.
But the most serious effect of weightlessness is on bones rather than muscles. The astronaut's whole skeleton starts to weaken. And for some reason that nobody quite understands, the body excretes calcium when weightless rather than using it to renew the bones as it would on Earth. After a long time in space, the astronaut's bones become so fragile they'll be unable to support his weight without breaking, and it could be irreversible. The Soviets have more experience of this than anyone else and seem confident they'll find the answer. But as yet, they've not told anyone what they think it is.
But there's another hazard. Now and again, things get pretty stormy on the sun. Huge solar flares reach out millions of miles into space, and with them comes a dangerous increase in radiation. If anyone had been up there in 1956, when there was the last really big sunstorm, they would have received a radiation dose as large as the workers at Chernobyl. So a Mars spacecraft would need some sort of storm shelter, part of the vehicle with extra thick walls to protect the crew.
And as well as keeping the crew physically fit, they must be psychologically happy. So the Soviets tried to make their space stations just like home. From plants and flowers to pictures of their leaders on the wall. They wake up to the sound of recorded birdsong. And when they're not tending their gardens, they can do some more training to fill their time on the long journey. For example, they could always take a degree in Martian geology.
Well, after the hazards of the journey come the hazards of actually surviving on the planet. Having landed safely, the crew would have to plan on staying for at least a year until Mars circled close enough to Earth for the return journey. And they'd have to cope with temperatures as low as -80 Celsius, a very thin atmosphere, and intense radiation. So one of their first priorities would be to build some sort of living quarters. One American plan suggests these will be built from the landing craft itself and buried under 2 or 3 meters of soil to protect against radiation. Well, although the Martian atmosphere is mainly carbon dioxide, there is enough oxygen and water vapour that could be extracted to support the crew and grow plants. But the eventual aim would be to make the colony completely self-supporting. And a remarkable experiment has just begun to determine how feasible that might be.
Here on the edge of the Arizona desert, a group of American scientists are building a space colony. It's the sort of colony we'd need to live on Mars. And when it's finished, it'll look like this. A complete life support system that's self-contained and self-sustaining. With a tropical rainforest at one end, in the space of just 2.5 acres, you'll be able to wander through a savanna, swim in the mini ocean, wade through a swamp, and even swelter in the desert. It's called a biosphere, a mini enclosed version of the Earth. But to see if it really can sustain life, 8 scientists will live inside this complex. But when the doors close on them in 1989, they'll be completely cut off from the outside world for 2 years. All the oxygen they breathe will come from the plants, and all the food that they eat will be grown in this arable area. One of the first creatures they'll take with them into their 20th century Noah's Ark will be fish. And that's because one particular type of fish is very easy to farm. These tilapia graze happily on the water hyacinths, and then the fish excrete ammonia. The bacteria in the water turns that ammonia into nitrates and nitrites, which in turn feeds the water hyacinths. It's the perfect cycle. The fish, of course, are there to be eaten by the inhabitants of the biosphere, but they'll have to be careful not to eat too many in case they disrupt that fine balance. And it seems that the first fruit to be grown and eaten in space will be the banana, because the plant takes such a short time to produce its fruit, about 11 months. Now, since the biosphere will be totally enclosed, no pesticides will be used on the plants. Instead, natural predators like ladybirds and specially bred wasps will be brought in to keep the balance right. They'll take the plants with them as disease-free cell cultures. Along with bananas, it looks as if we'd be taking strong flavors to make the food more interesting. Incidentally, irises will be taken to Mars just because they look nice. So, psychology also plays a part. While construction of the real biosphere goes ahead, this totally sealed structure will be used to find out which sort of vegetation will provide that perfect exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen that will be so vital to the survival of the humans. And to recreate the atmosphere inside the biosphere as closely as possible, the structure has been made with exactly the same materials, arranged in the same design as they would in the real biosphere. And just as in the real thing, these metal blinds can be adjusted to vary the sunlight, as they'll have to on Mars to protect the plants from the even harsher rays of the sun. If the experiment's a success, this is the kind of structure men on Mars will live in, a sort of home from home, 300 million miles away from Earth.
So, within a few years, we should have a good idea how people could survive on the surface of Mars. But how soon is that likely to be? We know the Soviets are aiming at the mid-1990s, but they've got a lot of problems to sort out first.
As for the Americans, well, NASA's budgets have been cut back for years, so it would take a major change in the political climate to produce the cash to send an astronaut to Mars. But it isn't too late to respond to the Soviet challenge, and many scientists are still convinced it could happen. So the question is not whether a man will land on Mars, but whether it'll be before the year 2000, and whose flag will be flying.